Okay, so the second story in this book is The Last Camp of Paul Bunyan, and it's Paul Bunyan Swings His Axe by Dell, McCormick, and it was published by Caxton Printers. So The Last Camp of Paul Bunyan. It was late in the summer when Paul and his faithful moose hound Elmer started back to Paul's camp on Tadpole Creek. Paul was tired after hunting the great moose. In spite of his great size, he could average only 40 or 50 miles away. One day, as he was resting in the Bitter Root Mountains of Idaho, he noticed Elmer sniffing in the air and acting very strange. "What's the matter, old boy?" asked Paul. "Are the grizzly bears in these woods?" In answer, the moose hound only ran forward and back in front of Paul, as if urging his master to continue the homeward journey at once. Every once in a while, he would point his nose toward the sky and growl and whine in terror. Paul climbed the nearest mountain to investigate. What a sight met his horror-stricken eyes! For miles and miles, as far as he could see, the forest was afire. Great clouds of black smoke rolled upward, leaping swiftly from treetop to treetop. The angry flames rushed toward Paul. Paul never thought of himself or the danger in the center of that raging fire, as was his camp on Tadpole Creek. What had happened to his men? Where were Tiny Tim and Ole and Johnny Inkslinger and all his brave crew? Had they perished in the flames? Without a thought for himself, he ran toward the raging wall of fire. Over rivers and lakes he leaped, and through the forest, stopping only to soak his great handkerchief in a mountain lake. With this tied over his nose and mouth so that he could breathe more easily, he plunged into the blazing forest fire. The smoke blinded him, and the fire burned great holes in his leather boots. On he ran through the forest fire that scorched his hands and burned his clothing. It was like a fiery furnace. At times he stumbled and fell, and the heat burned his beard to a crisp. Pulling himself to his feet at a mighty effort, he would stagger on. Soon he came to the blackened remains of his camp on Tadpole Creek. The great camp that covered so many acres was only a smoldering mass of ashes. The great griddle that was the pride of Hot Biscuit Slim and all of the cooks lay in the center of the ruins. It was bent out in shape of the intense heat. In all that fire-swept country, there were no trace of his brave men. Sadly, and with tears in his eyes, Paul Bunyan gazed over the blackened land that had once been the great forest that he loved so well. His brave crew had disappeared. What had happened to them as the raging forest fire surrounded the camp? Most of all, he missed Babe, his great blue ox, who had been companion on all of his many adventures. Although his feet were blistered with the great heat and his clothing hung in shreds, Paul went back to see if he could find Elmer, his faithful moose hound. By that time, the great forest fire had died out, and all the vast mountain country was covered with blackened stumps. Paul found Elmer with some loggers on the upper Snake River. The loggers looked at Paul in wonder. "Are you the great Paul Bunyan? We have heard so much about the man who has the largest logging camp in the world." "I am Paul Bunyan," he said, "but at last. My camp has burned and all my men destroyed in the great fire." The logger spoke up. "Your men are safe. We saw them escape. A great blue ox that was 100 times larger than any ox we had ever seen came through the woods. All the men followed him as he cut a path through the trees with his great hooves. They built rafts here on the Snake River and floated down into the Oregon country." Paul Bunyan cried with joy as he heard the great news. His men were safe. Burned and weary as he was, Paul laughed and shouted with joy. Elmer barked happily by his side. "What happened to Babe, the blue ox?" he asked Paul. The blue ox disappeared after leading the men to safety, said the loggers. Paul lay down to rest and was soon fast asleep. It was the first night's sleep he had had since the fire. In the morning, a soft, wet nose nudged his ears. When a large, rough tongue licked his cheek, it was Babe the Blue Ox who had found his master. The faithful animal had searched near and far until he had found Paul. The loggers were amazed at the great size of Paul Bunyan and his blue ox, and the enormous breakfast they ate together. They asked Paul if he were going down to the Oregon country. "No," said Paul, "my work is over. My men can join other logging camps in Oregon. I am tired and weary, and my beloved forest is burned to the ground. I am going to take Babe the Blue Ox and go up into the mountains where I can hunt and fish with my faithful dog." No more do the woods resound with the sharp blows of 7 axemen. Tiny Tim is no longer the water boy. Hot Biscuit Slim and Cream Puff Fatty are cooking in other camps in the Oregon woods. Brimstone Bill and Old the Big Sweetie were last seen in a logging camp near Bend, Oregon. They passed their later years telling of the brave deeds and mighty exploits of Paul Bunyan and of Babe the Blue Ox. Paul Bunyan had disappeared from the woods. Some say he is still roaming the forest of the West. No one has seen him, but the woodsmen say the low, rumbling thunder in the mountains of a summer night is Paul Bunyan calling to his faithful ox. Others say that the wind whistling through the tree tops is the sound of Paul Bunyan striding through the forest as of old.